But I had you worried. You thought I was going to get the silver trumpet out and try to match Mr. Herman. No. I'll leave that sort of trumpet blowing to him. We understand the significance of this day and what it does picture, because we are here this afternoon, this day, on a day that God refers to in the book of Leviticus chapter 23 as a Sabbath that is a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. A memorial of the blowing of trumpets. Now, we've been focusing in on the trumpets and on some of what that means and what that pictures a little bit earlier today. The entire fall festival season is ushered in by this particular day. This day that is a Sabbath, a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. There are two primary emphases in the fall festival season. One is denoted by the fact that this entire season is termed back in the book of Exodus, chapter 23. In Exodus chapter 23, let's notice the name that is used for this entire fall festival season, all of the festivals that occur during the seventh month of God's plan. In Exodus 23, in verse 14, it says, 3 times you shall keep a feast unto me in the year. There are 3 times, 3 seasons when festivals are to be kept. You're to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You're to eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you, in the time appointed of the month Abib. For in it you came out of the land of Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty. So 3 times we are to observe a festival. The first time is the time appointed of the month Abib. Now, Abib in the Hebrew language means green ears. That was the month of fresh green growth, of fresh new green shoots emerging from the ground. It was the month that inaugurated spring. So the first of the 3 times was the early spring. And that is when the days of unleavened bread occur. And in verse 16, and the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors, which you have sown in the field. This is the second of those 3 times. As Leviticus 23 and other places show, there are 7 weeks that are to be counted, during which the first fruits harvest occurs, and at the conclusion of this 7-week period, there is a celebration that celebrates the culmination of the early harvest, the first fruits harvest. And so the feast of the harvest of first fruits is celebrated 7 weeks later in the time that ends the spring season, right at the ending of spring, beginning of summer. And we're going on in verse 16, and the feast of ingathering, which is in the end of the year, when you have gathered in your labors out of the field. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the eternal God. The feast of ingathering. The great feast of gathering in, because the emphasis was a harvest emphasis. That was one of the major aspects of the fall festival season. It was the time of the great gathering harvest, the great ingathering. As God used the analogy of things in ancient Israel, the agricultural cycle in ancient Israel as a type of the great gathering in that will occur, that time of the great ingathering in His spiritual plan. Because just as there were 2 primary harvest seasons in ancient Israel, in terms of the agricultural year, there were 2 primary harvest seasons. There are also, in God's plan, 2 primary harvest seasons. An early first fruits harvest. Because we are, as we're told in the book of James and other places, a kind of first fruits of God's creatures. We are the first fruits of those whom God is calling. We represent not the sum total of all that God is calling and all that God will ever deal with down through time. We simply represent the first fruits. But there is coming a time of a great gathering in. And that third festival season, that season of ingathering, is inaugurated by this festival that occurs on the first day of the seventh month. The time of the new moon in the seventh month. A time inaugurated by the blowing of trumpets. That's one important aspect of this fall festival season. Another aspect of it, certainly alluded to by Mr. Herman in the sermonette, is that it is a time that does focus in on the establishment of God's universal reign on the earth. The time when the kingdom of God will be set up. A time when God will come forth to judgment. Yes, a time of war, a time of clouds, a time of gloominess that culminates in the establishment of the government of God. And that is also inaugurated on this day. There's an interesting psalm that was associated very much with this fall festival season. Psalm 81. Psalm 81. I want to read a couple of comments from the Jewish commentary on that psalm because I think that some of the background helps us to perhaps understand a little more clearly. In Psalm 81, it is a psalm for the leader upon the Gittith, a psalm of Asaph. Now, we just read this term Gittith, and that doesn't mean anything to most of us, but if you look it up as they bring out here in terms of the significance of that, it is derived from the same word. It's derived from the word for wine press, and it was therefore something that was associated with the time of vintage. Now, the time of the grape harvest and the time when the wine presses were being utilized was in the fall. That culminated at the time of the fall festival season. This was the time of the grape harvest. So it was a time, the association here is that it was something that was associated with the vintage, the time of the grape harvest, the time when the wine presses were running. And that analogy is used not only to refer to the feast, the fall festival period, but we're going to see a little later that God uses the analogy of the winepress to also refer in a spiritual sense of something that is going to occur and that He's going to be doing. It goes on and goes on to read, "Sing aloud unto God our strength, shout unto the God of Jacob. Take up the melody and sound the timbrel, the sweet harp with the psaltery. Blow the horn at the new moon, at the full moon, for our feast day. For it is a statute for Israel, an ordinance of the God of Jacob." Now, the term that's used for horn here, or trumpet as it renders it in the King James, is the Hebrew word shofar, the ram's horn. And as the commentary goes on to read here in the Sonsino, the Jewish commentary, this cannot refer to the blowing of the trumpet at each new moon, referred to in Numbers 10:10, because on that occasion, silver trumpets, and not the shofar, were sounded. The first day of the seventh month, however, was marked by blowing the shofar. That's mentioned in Numbers 29:1 as well as other places, and observed as a memorial proclaimed with the blast of the shofar. So what we read of here is specifically a reference, the new moon in which the shofar is blown, is this new moon, the first day of the seventh month. The first day of every month of the year, the silver trumpet was blown, but on this new moon, the beginning of this month, the shofar was also sounded. This was a day on which both trumpets were blown. And then it talks about the full moon, our feast day. And that I'm reading out of the Jewish translation, which is a little more literal, brings out a couple of things that are sort of obscured in the King James translation. And of course, the full moon that immediately comes after that, it comes 2 weeks later, is the beginning of the Feast of Tabernacles. So here is a psalm that puts as its focus the time of the vintage, the time of the harvest, and the time when God's harvest is brought in. It's a time it's a psalm that focuses specifically on the time when the shofar will be blown, a time that sets the stage for the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles. And it refers to something that's a statute, that's a law, part of God's festivals. It was appointed in Joseph for a testimony when he went forth through the land of Egypt. And this, of course, in two references. One, of course, Joseph himself, the literal Joseph, went through the land of Egypt with a proclamation of alarm. He announced the coming famine. You can read the story back in Genesis as he went through the land and proclaimed what was going to come to pass. And just as in our day, God has raised up a work in the modern day lands of Joseph to go forth proclaiming the events that are to come. And certainly, as God began to intervene there in Egypt to bring out the descendants of Joseph many years later, and that is described, God's intervention in bringing His people out of Egypt is described in chapter 81, a focus on the fact that ultimately God will deliver those that put their trust in Him. In verse 14 of Psalm 81, it says, "Oh, that my people would hearken unto me, that Israel would walk in my ways, I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their adversaries." You see, the time is coming, because right now God's people nationally do not hearken unto Him, and are not looking to Him, and are not walking in His ways. But God will subdue the enemies. He will subdue the adversaries. On over in Psalm 93, we have a psalm that as, again, the Jewish commentary brings out, says, the older commentators gave these psalms a messianic interpretation as relating to a reformed world in the future. They understood, the ancient Jewish commentators understood, that it was a time that was pictured in these psalms was not something that was describing merely a historical event of some ancient king, but it was a time yet future. We're celebrating the inauguration of this time. Psalm 93, the Lord reigns, He is clothed in majesty. The Eternal is clothed, He has girded Himself with strength. Yea, the world is established that it cannot be moved. Your throne is established of old, you are from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Lord, the floods have lifted up their voice, the floods lift up their roaring above the voice of many waters, the mighty breakers of the sea, the Lord on high is mighty. Your testimonies are very sure. Holiness becomes your house, O Lord, forevermore. God's testimonies, His laws, stand sure and are the basis on which His government is established. This is a time that commemorates when God is King, the eternal reigns. It is a time of deliverance. It is a time that anticipates God's universal kingship. The time when the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be removed. Brethren, we're living in perilous times. We're living in perilous times. The Scriptures talk about, in the last days, perilous times shall come. Dangerous times. And we're looking at that. We're living at a time that which we see an all-out assault by Satan the devil. It's a time when Satan wants to destroy God's work, to destroy God's people, to destroy God's people nationally and God's people spiritually. We are living in difficult times. Times that are setting the stage for the culmination of all these prophecies that you and I have read and heard for all these years. It's important that we step back a little bit and try to get in perspective what we're living through. When you're in the midst of an event, it's hard to see it in perspective. It either looms too large or it looms too small, but it's hard to see it really in perspective when we're right in the midst of something. You know, it's interesting sometimes if you look back at headlines that were contemporary with certain events. I remember not all that long ago looking at some reproductions of headlines that came out in October of 1929. Now we look back on that, and that is considered the beginning of the Great Depression. The great stock market crash of 29 occurred there in October of 1929. And yet, interestingly enough, looking at newspaper stories in the New York Times and other leading newspapers in October and November and December and on for a little while, they didn't come out the next day with headlines that said stock market has crashed, Great Depression has begun. Oh no, they were quoting government experts, Secretary of the Treasury, who assured them that it was merely a mild correction in the market, and that things were actually going to be better than ever. It's really interesting. You know, you read that and you realize that some of these government people, they give the same sort of stories all the way back, and their accuracy is about as good now as it was at that point, in terms of properly assessing the significance of events. They didn't properly assess the significance of that event. They didn't say that the United States is plunging into the worst economic catastrophe that it has experienced up until that time. Oh no, they didn't say that. They said, well, it's just sort of a mild correction in the market, and it'll straighten out, and better days are right around the corner. Prosperity is right around the corner. But it wasn't, was it? Really wasn't. No, there were some very dark days ahead as the 30s continued a time of deepening depression. And ultimately the depression itself we didn't really pull totally out of the depression until we started gearing up for World War II. That was when we had full employment again. When the factories were booming and we were putting out war material and millions of men were receiving draft notices and all of this sort of thing. It's hard to get events in their proper perspective. Brethren, there are things that are going on the world scene right now. There's a very interesting article that was in a recent issue of the Wall Street Journal talking about something that is setting the stage for some things right now in Europe. It was talking about the fact that right now there are multiple thousands, tens of thousands of Bosnian Muslims who are in exile in various parts of Europe. They're in Germany, they're in Switzerland, they're in various places displaced by the warfare in their homeland, are becoming increasingly upset and frustrated at the unwillingness of Europe to do something about the problems. Now, of course, there's a peace plan that is being pushed. It has not gone through yet, but the Muslim government in Bosnia has been forced to accede to it, in which about 50%, just about half of the territory, is going to be forfeited to the Serbs who have come in there and sort of taken it over. So a lot of these people who are in exile don't have anywhere to go back home to. If they go back home to the villages from whence they came, they're going to be under the rulership of the people that chased them out and tried to kill them. Needless to say, they're not enthusiastic about that. And the article went on to show how they are now increasingly making common cause with many of the Arab Muslims in the Middle East, who are telling them that the way to have their grievances heard is to bring the war, to bring the strife right into the streets of Europe. When we read in the book of Daniel, we read that there are two combines that set up that will ultimately come to blows in the Middle East. One is called the King of the North, and the other is called the King of the South. As we look at the history of the Middle East, we find that for many, many centuries, there has been a conflict of powers to the north and a conflict of powers to the south. Now, in ancient times, we find, going back to the time after the fall of Alexander the Great's empire, that there was conflict over the Middle East, and it was headed up by a Seleucid kingdom that derived from Seleucus, who was one of Alexander's generals. And it was headquartered in Babylon to the north. And it was an empire that took in most of modern-day Syria and Iraq and that area, and it sought to come in and to occupy Palestine, to occupy Jerusalem from the north. But there was another kingdom headed up by the descendants of Ptolemy, who was another of Alexander's generals, and it was centered in Egypt and in North Africa and across in the Arabian Peninsula. And it was the Ptolemaic kingdom. It was south of Jerusalem. And the power in this area also wanted to expand north and to take Jerusalem. Well, we find that as time went on, the battle went back and forth. We find much of it detailed in the book of Daniel. As we come on down to the time of the Roman Empire, we find that the Roman Empire swallowed up that area and for a period of a few centuries so totally dominated that area that there was no effective opposition to it. But in the time of the Emperor Constantine, the Roman Empire split for administrative purposes into the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire maintained its capital at Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire maintained its capital at a new city called Constantinople, located where modern-day Istanbul, Turkey is, right there at the spot where Europe and Asia come together as the Turkish Peninsula and the Balkan Peninsula almost meet there at the Dardanelles, the Bosporus, where the Black Sea flows out into the Mediterranean. Constantine took this ancient city and built it up and renamed it Constantinople, and this was the administrative capital of the Eastern Empire. And the Middle Eastern area in Jerusalem was administered from the Eastern Empire, and things went on for a period of time, but finally about the 7th century, there arose a combine originating in the Arabian Peninsula. And the revolution launched by Mohammed and his immediate followers that swept across from Arabia, across into Iraq, and across into Egypt, and across North Africa, began to push up into the Middle East. And there was conflict between Constantinople in the north and the Islamic powers centered in Egypt to the south. And this was a conflict that continued on through the period of much of the Middle Ages. This is what the Crusades were launched about, as the Pope called upon the Holy Roman Emperor to come in and to reconquer Jerusalem. The reconquest of the Holy Land. Well, this remained finally under Islamic rule on up until modern times. And now, once again, for the first time in 2,000 years, there is a Jewish state centered in Jerusalem and in Judea. There was an absence of many centuries during which there was not a Jewish state. But there is now, and there has been for most of this century, or a goodly part of this century. The Jews were given official permission to establish a homeland with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the homeland itself being proclaimed in 1949 as official and independent. But today the stage is being set for once again a conflict between a power to the north, centered in Europe, a power that is primarily Catholic in its focus, and a power to the south that is Islamic. We see the stage being set. We see the stage being set in Europe. The book of Daniel talks about that. Daniel gives a progression. Daniel was a young Jew who was taken captive to Babylon. And in the book of Daniel, we have an overview of the ups and downs of the world-ruling Gentile empires that will ultimately culminate with destruction of those forces and of those powers by the returning Jesus Christ, who comes back as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And the book of Daniel carries us through in terms of Daniel's life experience there in the Babylonian court, and some of the significant visions that he was given and the interaction he had with the kings of Babylon. Because much of what Daniel went through and much of what he told those ancient kings foreshadowed events that are to come that will culminate in our time. Now, brethren, Jesus Christ told His disciples in Matthew chapter 24, told them in Mark 13 and Luke 21, which are parallel accounts of the same event. The time when Jesus was speaking on the Mount of Olives, answering private questions from His disciples who wanted to know what would be the sign of His coming in power and glory. What would be the sign of the establishment of the glorious kingdom of the Messiah? What would be the sign of bringing in those things? And Jesus went through and He talked about various events. And then He told them, He said, it's like the fig tree. When it begins to bud out and put out new growth, you know that summer is coming. Even so, when you see these things begin to come to pass, then know that the time of your redemption draws near. The Scripture does say that no man can know the day or the hour. God has not given us some clear-cut chronology that is to allow us to pinpoint and to circle a date on the calendar and to say, yes, that's it. I'll take a nap, wake me up 10 minutes before it starts. But there are events that we certainly can know the general time. We're told that there are signs of the times. Christ told the Pharisees, He said, you look at the sky and you can tell the weather that's coming. But you can't discern the signs of the times. Brethren, we ought to be able to discern the signs of the times. God wants us to understand the times in which we live. As we see many of these events that began to shape up on the world scene. As we see events that are going on in the Middle East. As we see an increasingly prominent role being taken by the Catholic Church, by the papacy in world events. Have you noticed who's a major player at this conference in Cairo, Egypt? It's the Vatican. Now, they may not get their way, but the stage is being set for an increasingly prominent role to be played on the world scene by the Vatican. After a long period of time of sort of dormancy, the Vatican has taken an increasingly prominent position in terms of focusing on events to occur and interacting with the other states. Certainly in Europe, they've even made common cause with some of the Muslims over this particular conference that's being held in Cairo. But the stage is being set because there is going to emerge in Europe the core of something that will have worldwide implications. It's called Babylon the Great. It is going to emerge centered in Europe. And it'll have worldwide implications. When you read in the book of Revelation, you read in the book of Isaiah and other places, we read of all nations being involved in this great trading combine. Babylon the Great has religious significance, it has military and political significance, and it has economic significance. It has impact and significance in all of these major areas. It is the final restoration of what began a long, long time ago. You know, we read the beginnings of Babylon very early in the pages of the Bible. Right after the flood, we read that all the earth was of one language. And we read in Genesis chapter 10. In Genesis chapter 11. We read of a man and of an event. We read of a man by the name of Nimrod, the grandson of Ham. And we read of an event, the beginning of the building of a tower on the plains of Shinar. Come, let us make us a name that we won't be scattered abroad. Of course, God had told them to spread abroad and to replenish the earth. They didn't want to do that. And Nimrod gathered together a great number of the people and began this great building program that centered on a tower, the Tower of Babel. Babel. That was the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom, and it began to spread out throughout the plains of Shinar. That was the beginning of Babylon. Well, God intervened, and He put a stop to the city that Nimrod was building. He confounded the languages, and the people were forced to begin to move and to spread out to the various areas of the earth that God had intended them to go. But that was not the end of the city of Babel. It was from that general area that the patriarch Abraham, or Abram as he was known, it was from that general area that his family came. And Abram responded to God's call to get up and away from his father's house and away from his kindred and to leave that area, to come out of Babylon, as it were, and to go to a place that God would show him, a land that he would afterward have for an inheritance. And we're told in Genesis 12 that Abraham obeyed. He simply did what God asked of him. And he left. And then we began to focus in on the story of Abraham and on the things that God did through Abraham and through his family. And as we come here to the book of Daniel, we come to Daniel, who was, of course, a descendant of Abraham, a prince of Judah. And we find that Daniel has been taken captive as a young man, as a teenager, and brought to Babylon. Because once again, Babylon has emerged on the world scene. And in the book of Daniel, we find that Babylon, the Babylon of Daniel's day, represented the beginning of a sequence that would only culminate when the God of heaven intervened. Daniel was taken as a captive to Babylon. We find that just a year after he had been in Babylon, we read a story in Daniel chapter 2 of Nebuchadnezzar being troubled by a dream that he had. And when he awakened, he couldn't remember all of what the dream was about, but it bothered him and troubled him, and he wanted to know what it meant. And he called for all of the soothsayers and the astrologers and the various ones, and none of them could tell him what it meant. because he couldn't even tell them what the dream was, or wouldn't. And they said, well, if you'll tell us the dream, we'll tell you what it means. And he says, if you could tell me what it means, you could tell me what I dreamed. If I tell you what I dreamed, you'll just make up something. You know, if you really have some sort of divine inspiration, you ought to be able to, you shouldn't have any trouble telling me what I dreamed. Why would that be any harder than telling me what it meant? Well, they couldn't do that, you see. They knew that if they just made up something about what he dreamed, that he would know that, no, that's not what I dreamed. Then they'd really be in trouble. So Nebuchadnezzar got mad, and he was just ready to just wipe out, to just obliterate all of that whole group of people. Well, Daniel came in and presented himself before the king, and he said, O king, there is a God in heaven that is a revealer of secrets, and he it is that makes known unto the king the things that shall come to pass. And he described the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had seen of this great image, this colossal image set up on the plains of Shinar. And how it had a head of gold and a chest and shoulders of silver, thighs of brass and legs of iron. And the feet were most peculiar because they were a blend of ceramic clay and iron. Now, ceramic clay and iron does not bond well together. And it is something that one good heavy blow would shatter all of the ceramic out from the clay, from the iron, and this would all fall apart. It was not a durable mixture. It was not something that made an alloy as melting together two metals such as copper and brass. So he described this to Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar said, yes, that's what I dreamed. And Daniel said, let me explain the significance of it to you. You, O king, are a king of kings. You are this head of gold, the great Babylonian empire that you sit at the helm of. This represents the kingdom of gold. That is to be followed by another kingdom, a second kingdom that will arise inferior to you. Just as silver is inferior to gold. And of course there was a second kingdom that arose. We read of it in the book of Daniel. Just a little further back, about Daniel chapter 6, we read of the time when Nebuchadnezzar's grandson was presiding over the Babylonian Empire a number of years later. And how on the very evening that began the Feast of Trumpets in 539 BC, the Persian forces entered Babylon. And Babylon fell. And the Persian Empire was established with its headquarters at Babylon. Cyrus the Great set up a kingdom, an empire, that did various things, including permitting the Jews to return to Jerusalem, rebuild it. But the empire of the Medes and the Persians continued on down for a period of time, but it was not a permanent empire. It didn't represent the permanent state of things because there was a third empire, a third great kingdom, the kingdom of the Greeks under Alexander the Great, who conquered the Medes and the Persians. And at the great battle that defeated the Medes and the Persians that Alexander led, establishing an empire that spanned the entire Middle Eastern area, that ran all the way from the Balkans in Europe all the way across to the Indus River in India. A great, vast empire throughout which the Greek language and the Greek culture was predominant. But that didn't last either. Alexander died, and his four primary generals wound up after a few years and had sort of divided the empire among themselves. And then there arose a fourth empire, symbolized by the iron in Daniel's vision. That fourth great empire, the empire of iron, the Roman Empire, that swallowed up all of what came before and established a great empire. And just, of course, as there are two legs of iron, the Roman Empire stood on two legs, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. That's the way that it came on down. And we find that there are finally 10 toes on these 2 feet, which of course represent something that once again, within these 10 toes, you have the final successors of both the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. Now, you know, we've preached about that, and I've got sermons that I gave way back, certainly as far back as way back in the 70s, in mid-70s, down in Corpus Christi and in Houston, focusing in on some of that. Events that we didn't understand fully exactly how they were going to come about, but we knew that it was going to have to occur. I can show you copies of the Plain Truth magazine that date back decades, back to the time of 1949 when the Iron Curtain rung down in Europe. And Mr. Herbert Armstrong was talking about the fact that some of the nations located behind the Iron Curtain were eventually going to have to reemerge, and that there would come a united Europe headed by a reunited, revitalized Germany. 40 years ago, when Europe was still ashes in the aftermath of World War II. Because you see, he understood this progression that is described right here. We find a final culmination, a final representation of this Babylon, of this great image, the 10 toes and the stone cut out without hands that comes down and smashes the image on its toes. Because that's the part of the image that is extant. And the whole image turns to dust and it blows away. And the stone of supernatural origin grows and becomes a great mountain and fills the whole earth. That's what Daniel explained to the king in Daniel chapter 2. Now, Nebuchadnezzar didn't get everything out of this explanation he should have, because when you read chapter 3, you find that what Nebuchadnezzar got out of it was the idea of building a great image, which was not the point that he should have got. He built a great image, and he built it of gold, because after all, the head of gold symbolized him, right? So he built this giant image and set it up and decided that everybody ought to worship it. And then you read the story of Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was not particularly swift in picking up on the significance of some of these things that Daniel showed him. And so in Daniel chapter 4, we have an event that is even more remarkable. Nebuchadnezzar had another dream. And Daniel was called to interpret that, and he said, "King, you're not going to like what this dream means. And I hate to tell you what it means. But you saw a great tree, and the branches were spread out, and birds were nesting in it, and animals dwelt under it and in it. And then there was a voice from heaven. And a watcher, a holy one, speaking of an angel, came down. And the command was given to cut down the tree. And it was cut down. Nevertheless, the command was to leave the stump with the roots in the earth, to band it with a band of iron and brass. And it would stay there, because eventually that stump would be watered and new shoots would begin to come forth, and a tree would ultimately emerge after 7 times had passed over it. He told King Nebuchadnezzar, he said, "Look, you need to understand that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, and He gives them to whomsoever He will, sometimes even to the basest of men. your king, your kingdom, is going to be cut off. And you are going to be absolutely insane like a wild animal. And 7 literal times, 7 years will pass over you. And then you will reemerge. And you will be restored to your kingdom. To the purpose that you may know that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomsoever He will. This is brought out in verse 32 of Daniel chapter 4. Now Nebuchadnezzar went through that as a literal thing. And when he reemerged with his sanity after this 7-year period, he got the point. He recognized that God was able to abase all that walk in pride, and that no one can set himself up in that way. Nebuchadnezzar learned a certain lesson, and he wrote even a certain portion here of Daniel chapter 4. Well, a few years later, we pick up the story again in Daniel 5, and by now, in Belshazzar, the co-ruler, was actually the one who was exercising authority in Babylon. And Belshazzar made a great feast. And as you go through and put the whole thing together, you find that this feast coincided with the evening that began the Feast of Trumpets. It was a feast of the new moon in the 7th month. It was an event that was 2,532 years ago. 2,532 years ago last night was the anniversary, 2,532nd anniversary of the events that are recorded right here in Daniel 5. Belshazzar made a great feast. And as the evening wore on, and as the drinking got more and more, Belshazzar decided to bring in the sacred vessels that had been brought from the temple in Jerusalem. And the sacred vessels that had been used in the worship of God were to be used only by the priests, were to be used in making offerings to God. These vessels were to be brought into the banquet hall. And he had them filled with wine and began to propose toasts to the gods of gold and silver and brass and wood and stone. And as all of the boisterous uproar was getting louder and louder, and as the liquor flowed, all of a sudden a great light filled a corner of the room, and a hand appeared out of nowhere. And even in a room full of a bunch of drunks, things got quiet awfully quickly. As they began to look and they saw this disembodied hand, bright and glowing, and it began to write in glowing letters on the wall strange terms. Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Now these were words that had meaning in the Chaldee or Aramaic language. They were units of measurement, units of weight. But it's as though you and I saw an event like this, and on the wall the words appeared pounds, tons, and ounces. That would be the rough equivalent. That wouldn't mean a whole lot, but it would sure as the world scare the daylights out of you. We're told that it basically scared Belshazzar about as close to sober as he'd been in a long time. We're told that the joints of his loins were loosed. If you check that up in the commentary, you find that simply means he had a rather embarrassing accident that occurred about that time. because he saw something that he, as we're told here in Daniel 5:6, the king's countenance was changed. His thoughts troubled him. The joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. And he was scared as he saw these things. And they brought in, finally, Daniel. Daniel, by this time, was an elderly man. Daniel had served the king's grandfather and had been in a position of great authority at an earlier time. Now Daniel is brought in before Belshazzar. And he offers to make Daniel the third ruler of the kingdom, because he himself, of course, was the second after his father Nabonidus. And Daniel said, "You keep your rewards. They're not going to do anybody any good. I don't want them. But I will tell you what this writing means. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And your kingdom is this night going to be divided to the Medes and to the Persians." He began to talk to the king about pride. He told him in verse 18 of Daniel 5, "The Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, your ancestor, a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor, and the majesty that he gave him, all the people and nations and languages trembled before him." Verse 20, "When his heart was lifted up, he was deposed from his throne, and they took the glory from him. He was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, until he knew that the Most High ruled in the kingdoms of men, that he appoints over it whomsoever he will. But you have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this." You remember that when you were just a child. You remember those events occurring. You remember the stories that you heard about what happened to your grandfather. You remember what happened. You knew this. But you have been lifted up in pride, and you have contempt for the God of heaven. And you've expressed that contempt here this evening. But the God of heaven will not be mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. The God of heaven will not be mocked. This night, your kingdom is taken from you. This night. Meaning, Tikal, Upharsin. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. It's weighed in the balances. You're found wanting. You have come up short. It's divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And verse 30, "And that night was Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius the Mede, Cyrus's uncle, came in and took the kingdom." Cyrus had waited until it was certain that Babylon was going to fall, and then he took his army and moved toward Nabonidus, and his uncle Darius the Mede actually entered Babylon and reigned there in Babylon until Cyrus's return. That very night. When God's judgment comes, it comes swiftly. The stump was cut down, the tree was cut down, but the stump remained. It was banded, and it awaited the time when it would begin to put forth shoots, and new growth would emerge. Brethren, we're in that time. We're in that time. Well, we have the story here in chapter 6 as to how Darius got acquainted with the God of Daniel. Chapter 7 sets the story by going back to an earlier time and telling of a vision that Daniel had during the time of Belshazzar. Here Daniel saw something that paralleled the earlier vision that Nebuchadnezzar had recorded in Daniel 2. Nebuchadnezzar had seen a great image made of several metals. Daniel here saw 4 beasts. a lion, a bear, a four-headed leopard, and a great terrible beast with teeth of iron. And he sees this progression. These creatures, wild creatures that emerged, that represented four kingdoms, as we're told in verse 17. Four kingdoms that were to come, were to arise out of the earth. But the culmination again is that the saints of the Most High will take the kingdom. See, Daniel 7 and Daniel 2 both end with the same event. The time when the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. A kingdom that will usher in the final rulership of God's government on this earth. As we read on through, in chapter 8, we find another vision that Daniel had in the third year of Belteshazzar, in which he saw two goats that were contending. As he describes here, he saw this vision, and he saw a ram that was pushing, and this he-goat that came up and smashed the ram. And he sees in Daniel chapter 8 the conflict that was to eventually occur between the Persian Empire and the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great. And now Alexander's empire would smash the Persians, and that's, of course, exactly what we're told. You see, the visions interpret, or the Bible interprets itself, because we're told on down here a little bit later in verse 20. It's not just my interpretation. Verse 20, the ram which you saw having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. The rough goat is the king of Grecia. The great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. That's Alexander. And being broken, four stood up. Four kingdoms shall stand up out of that nation, but not in his power, referring to the four successor generals of Alexander, Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus, who divided Alexander's empire. And that ultimately out of those four there were to emerge two primary ones. One centered north of Jerusalem, one centered south. Known from this time on as the king of the north and the king of the south. And as we finally come down here in chapter 11, a very detailed prophecy, in chapter 11 and verse 40, we find that at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him, like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over, and enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. So we find that there is to be an emergence of two great powers, one centered north, the revival of Babylon, the beast power, as it is called, that will come in and smash a power to the south, an Islamic Arab combine, to establish its rule right there in Jerusalem. Jesus spoke of it, in Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13. He spoke of the abomination that was spoken of by Daniel the prophet. He spoke of a yet future event that was to occur. Brethren, events are shaping up behind the scenes in the Middle East that are setting the stage for the final culmination. If there's one thing that we should have learned from the events that have occurred in the past, going back to 1989, you remember what happened at this time in 1989, just a matter of 5 years ago. Just 5 years ago, it was in August and September of 1989 that things began to come unraveled in Eastern Europe, beginning with Poland, and very quickly spreading. You remember, we watched it on television, most of us did, during the Feast of Tabernacles of 1989. These events, the most world-shaking events, setting the stage for the emergence of the final resurrection of the Roman Empire. Because you see, the post-World War II order lasted 40 years, from 1949 until 1989. Two camps, American-dominated and Russian-dominated. Europe was divided. And all sorts of people thought, well, the showdown, that's Russia and America. Brethren, the World War II, the post-World War II order passed away in a matter of days. In a matter of days, it passed from the scene. And the gates of the Berlin Wall were flung open. And people came pouring across, and communist governments in Eastern Europe toppled like dominoes, and by the first of the year, Germany was reunited. Incredible. Incredible. The events that occurred. When God's time comes for things to happen, they can happen oh so quickly. We can go along prior to that time and we keep looking and we keep watching, and it seems like things are just moving interminably slowly, and we don't see this great thing happening and that great thing happening. Oh, if we look closely, we can see that the stage is being set. When God's time comes, things can happen oh so quickly. But you know, it will happen in a way that most will not perceive. I remember listening to the commentators. These were men who are very highly paid, men who make well over $100,000 a year. In fact, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Their opinions are considered oh so valuable. These men were commentators for CBS and for ABC and NBC. These men were giving their pronouncements and their interpretation of the events in the fall of 1989. And none of them got it right. Even as those events were occurring around them, they were saying, well, maybe by the end of the century Germany might reunite. But, you know, we really shouldn't read too much significance into it. Within weeks, Germany had finalized its plans to reunite. Events were unfolding daily, and they didn't recognize the significance of it. They didn't grasp what was happening until it had occurred. Brethren, the post-World War II order has been washed away. Things had to happen in Eastern Europe. Things had to happen in what was the Soviet Union, because a powerful communist Soviet Union would never have allowed Babylon the Great to emerge, headed by a reunited Germany. They never would have allowed it had they been in a position to stop it. But that's what we have to understand. When God's time comes, there is nothing that can stop what God has set in motion. The God of heaven has a plan, and that plan is unfolding right on schedule. We're standing in the time prior to the emergence of that final seventh resurrection of the old Holy Roman Empire, spoken of back in the book of Revelation. There are events that are described in Revelation. Let's notice. In Revelation chapter 6, we have a book that has 7 seals. And the Lamb who is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Lamb of God, Jesus Christ, who is worthy, who alone is worthy to open these seals. He begins to open them one at a time. The effect is cumulative because, you see, as one is opened, it remains open, and then the next one is opened behind it. And as these seals are loosed, we find in Revelation 6, when the first seal is loosed, a white horse rides forth. Goes forth conquering and to conquer. Has a crown and a bow. The bow being the symbol of Nimrod, the mighty hunter. And then the second seal is opened. A red horse rides forth that has power to take peace from the earth. And when the third seal is opened, a black horse rides forth. And the rider has a pair of balances in his hand. And food is being measured out in tiny measurements. It is being rationed. Just a portion of food for a day's wages. And then in verse 7, the fourth seal is opened. And a ghastly pale horse rides forth. And his name is Death and Hades. And he has power over a fourth part of the earth to kill them with the sword and with hunger and with death and with the beasts of the earth. And then a fifth seal is opened. And at this point, John saw a vision in heaven. He saw the lives of God's people who had been martyred down through the centuries. He saw a vision of an altar in heaven. Now, the altar in the temple had a catch basin down there where the blood of the sacrificial animals was collected. And what John sees figuratively is the blood of all of the martyrs of God down through the centuries, there under this altar. Those who were slain and who are crying out. Just as the blood of righteous Abel, God said, cried out from the ground, demanding vengeance, how much more does the blood of all of the righteous servants of God, from righteous Abel all the way down to the times ahead of us, cry out, demanding that a just God bring about justice. Those who had been slain were told to wait, remain in their grave, because there was an event that was yet to occur. There was a future martyrdom of saints that was to occur. And after that, the God of heaven would intervene. And then you see the sixth seal opens in verse 12. And there is a great earthquake, and there are tremendous signs in the heavens that occur. And this sets the stage in verse 17 for the great day of the wrath of God. Because the first 5 seals represent the wrath of Satan. Jesus interprets these seals. He was the only one found worthy to open them. And so if we're going to look for a revealing of what they mean, we have to look to where Jesus Christ gave the explanation. And we find that in Matthew 24, as well as the parallel accounts of Mark 13 and Luke 21. In Matthew 24, verse 5, He told the disciples, "Many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and deceive many." There would come false prophets, coming forth on the white horse, masquerading as Jesus Christ. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, the red horse. And we're told that famine in verse 7, the black horse, with food being rationed. And we're told pestilence, disease epidemics, the pale horse of death would ride forth. And then we're told in verse 21 of Matthew 24 that then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world of this time, no nor ever again shall be, and except those days should be shortened, there would no flesh be saved alive. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. a time of a future martyrdom of saints, when others will be killed, just as God's servants have in the past. And in verse 29 we're told that immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. The sixth seal, the heavenly signs, because you see at that point the God of heaven begins to intervene. And the sixth seal, the heavenly signs, is the signal that God is ready to step into history. The servants of God, the sealing of God's servants is completed in Revelation chapter 7. And in Revelation chapter 8, the seventh seal is opened. And then seven angels having seven trumpets, which together constitute the seventh seal, the day of the Lord, that represent God's judgment. In verse 6, the seven angels that had the seven trumpets prepared to sound. The first angel sounded. There was a tremendous event. Hail and fire mingled with blood was cast upon the earth, and a third of the vegetation was destroyed. And the second angel sounded, and a third part of the sea became blood. And the third angel sounded in verse 10, and a third part of the fresh water became blood, became bitter, was undrinkable. In verse 12, the fourth angel sounded, and there were cataclysmic events in the heavens, resulted in the earth being thrown out of its orbit, or at least off its axis. And then we're told in verse 13 that the next three were going to be far worse. Woe, 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 by reason of the voices of the next three angels. In chapter 9 and verse 1, the fifth angel sounds, which is the first woe. And this creature that has been held in abeyance goes forth to absolutely destroy. This represents a launching of an attack, undoubtedly a nuclear attack, against the Asian countries, and undoubtedly probably Russia itself, as well as China, nations to the east, as the alliance that has temporarily held together begins to unravel. And just as in times past, Napoleon and the Tsar were allies, and Napoleon decided to stab his ally, just as Hitler and Stalin were allies, and Hitler decided to get his ally before his ally got him. You see, the trouble with allies like that is neither of them trust the other. And so once again, the alliance will be a very short-term, very temporary alliance, an iron and clay type of mixture that will see this great beast power launch its assault on its erstwhile allies to the east. And there will be tremendous weapons that will be unleashed that will result in cataclysmic destruction. In verse 13, the sixth angel sounds, and demon spirits that had been bound at the river Euphrates are unleashed, and they gather this army of 200 million from the east to invade the Middle East and to do battle with the European troops there. Realizing right there in the context of the Middle East, all these weapons are of very little avail. Because part of what they're fighting over is the oil fields of the Middle East, and the last thing they need to do is to destroy them where they're of no value to anyone. You can't set off those things there where their own headquarters will be at that time and where their own troops are. This vast army begins to pour forth, to converge at Armageddon, and to invade Jerusalem. And they have great weapons. And we find that a third part of people die. A third of the population is killed as a result of the fire and the smoke and the brimstone. Cataclysmic events that are on the verge of destroying life on the planet. And then we find in chapter 10 and verse 6 that there will be no further delay. But the seventh angel is going to begin to sound. And at that point, the mystery of God will be finished. And in chapter 11 and verse 14, when the second woe is past, the third is quickly come. The seventh angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven, saying, The kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of His Christ, and He shall reign forever and ever. And we find that Jesus Christ comes forth. The nations are angry. The time of God's judgment is at hand. It is a time when Babylon the Great is fallen. It is a time when the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be removed. It is a time when the seven last plagues are to be poured out, as it describes in Revelation chapter 16. And when the seventh plague comes, it is done. It is finished. There is a great earthquake. We're told in Revelation 16:18, so great, such as has not been since the world began. An earthquake that is so massive that it absolutely rearranges the topography of the earth. And Jesus Christ returns to this earth and alights in power and glory on the Mount of Olives, and the mountain cleaves in two. It's the time when the dead in Christ will rise. And those of us that are alive and remain will be caught up together with them to meet the Lord in the air, to return there to the Mount of Olives as described in Zechariah 14. A time that looks forward to the time when God will celebrate the culmination of His great spiritual harvest. The enthronement of Jesus Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Oh yes, the God of heaven rules in the affairs of men. He sets over nations whomsoever He will. He's allowed even the basest of men to hold sway. But there is a time of judgment. There is a time of reckoning. God is not mocked. And just as there came a time of accountability for Belshazzar of old, so there is a time of accountability coming for modern Babylon. There are going to be different people in different categories. That's been alluded to in earlier sermons and sermonettes. For some, it'll be a time of great joy and ecstasy. The culmination of everything for which we've hoped and dreamed. Our entrance into the glorious family of God. Our rebirth as glorified spirit beings. As we have borne the image of the earthly, we shall bear the image of the heavenly. We will share with Jesus Christ the glory that He has. Glorified sons of God. For those who are in the first resurrection, it'll be a time of ecstasy. The greatest exciting event that has ever occurred. As Mr. McNair alluded to earlier, for some it will be a time of weeping and gnashing of teeth. God is not mocked. Jesus Christ made it very plain that we have our part to do. It's the Father's good pleasure to give to you the kingdom. God wants us there. He wants you there. He wants me there. But brethren, we have to follow through to make our calling and election sure. Our calling is compared to the pearl of great price. Brethren, if you don't value something, you lose it. You misplace it. You lay it down. You walk off and leave it. The truth of God is precious and must be valued. It is that pearl of great price for which we are to sacrifice everything else in order to acquire and to hold. How much do we value that pearl of great price? Because I'm here to tell you, if you don't value it, you're not going to hold on to it. Nobody ever holds on to and keeps up with something that is unimportant to him. It's got to be precious. No, for some, that day will be a time of great ecstasy. For others, it'll be a time of weeping and gnashing of teeth. It'll be a time of deliverance. For some, we're told that when that great trumpet is blown, those that were ready to perish in the land of Assyria will be brought forth. It'll be a time of deliverance for many of the captive peoples of Israel. It'll be a time of judgment and wrath for the great empires that are destroying the earth. The God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom. And that is going to be ushered in by the blast of trumpets, the fanfare of the silver trumpet, the enthronement of the King of Kings, the blast of alarm of the shofar, the signal of war, the warning that goes forth. Brethren, Babylon the Great is going to fall. The God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that will never be removed. Nimrod built a city that will not endure. Oh, he intended to build a city that was permanent, and he started out building a great tower. But the outcome of Nimrod's city you read of in Revelation 18. It's going to be a hole in the ground. But when Abraham left the land of the Chaldeans, when he left the plain of Shinar and went out to a place that he would afterward receive for an inheritance, he went out looking for a city. A city that has foundations, whose maker and builder is God. And that city is the New Jerusalem, that will ultimately come down from God out of heaven. A city that will endure on into eternity, that will be inhabited by Abraham and by those who are accounted as the children of faith. As we are here on this Feast of Trumpets, this day that celebrates the beginning of this fall festival season, it is a sobering time and it is a time of rejoicing. But brethren, the time is coming when this day will be fulfilled. When He that shall come will come and will not tarry. That time is coming. That time when the whole creation that groans and travails will finally enter into the glorious liberty of the children of God. We're here to celebrate that day. This day that is a certain memorial of things that are to come.